Hey man, there's a moment every man remembers, even if he didn't understand it at the time. A moment where something felt off, but he ignored it because it didn't look dangerous. She wasn't loud, she wasn't aggressive, she wasn't demanding, she was soft, gentle, almost fragile, and that's exactly why he dropped his guard. Because when a woman presents herself as innocent, harmless, or unaware, a man's instinct is to protect, not to question. He assumes there is no agenda, because nothing looks threatening, and that assumption is where influence begins, quietly, invisibly, without resistance. Innocence is one of the most powerful psychological tools a woman can use, not because it's fake in every case, but because it disarms logic. When a woman appears unsure, confused, or emotionally delicate, a man instinctively steps into a role he didn't consciously choose. He becomes softer, more patient, more forgiving. He starts explaining himself more. He starts justifying her behavior. He starts absorbing emotional responsibility that was never his to carry. And all of this happens without a single demand being made. That's the part most men never see. Influence doesn't always arrive as control. Sometimes it arrives as vulnerability. A woman doesn't need to raise her voice to shift a dynamic. She doesn't need to issue ultimatums or threats. All she has to do is look unsure, wounded, or misunderstood, and the man begins adjusting himself. He lowers his standards, he relaxes his boundaries, he starts second-guessing his reactions, not because she asked him to, but because he doesn't want to feel like the bad guy. Innocence creates moral pressure. It frames the man as the one with power, which quietly forces him to behave like he owes her gentleness, leniency, and endless understanding. What makes this so effective is that it doesn't feel manipulative in the moment. It feels human, it feels emotional, it feels real. A man tells himself he's being kind, mature, emotionally intelligent. He believes he's doing the right thing by giving her the benefit of the doubt, by overlooking inconsistencies, by excusing disrespect because she didn't mean it that way. But over time, that generosity turns into imbalance. He's constantly explaining, constantly reassuring, constantly regulating, not just his emotions, but hers too. And she never had to ask for that power. It was handed to her the moment he mistook innocence for absence of influence. The most dangerous form of influence is the kind that doesn't look intentional. When a woman says, "I didn't realize," "I didn't think it would hurt you," or "that's not how I meant it," the man often hears sincerity. But psychologically, those phrases shift responsibility away from her actions and onto his reaction. Suddenly the focus isn't on what she did, it's on why he feels the way he feels. And once that shift happens repeatedly, he begins questioning his own emotional responses. He becomes hesitant to assert himself. He becomes cautious about setting boundaries, not because he's weak, but because he doesn't want to hurt someone who appears innocent. Over time, this creates a subtle but powerful dynamic. She gets to act without consequence, while he becomes hyper-aware of how his reactions might make her feel. He starts softening his language, delaying difficult conversations, letting things slide that would never have been acceptable in any other context. And the more he does this, the more the imbalance grows. She may not even be consciously exploiting it, but the system benefits her either way. Innocence protects her from accountability, while his empathy slowly erodes his authority within the relationship. This is why so many men feel confused rather than angry when things fall apart. They don't feel wronged, they feel guilty. Guilty for reacting, guilty for pulling back, guilty for finally speaking up. And that guilt doesn't come from logic, it comes from the emotional framing that was set early on. The idea that she was fragile, that she didn't know better, that she needed understanding more than boundaries. By the time he realizes he's been carrying the emotional load alone, he's already been conditioned to feel like asserting himself would make him cruel. A woman who leans into innocence doesn't need to control you directly. She just needs you to control yourself. She needs you to hesitate, to doubt, to soften, to restrain your natural masculine clarity in favor of emotional accommodation. And most men comply because they believe that's what maturity looks like. But maturity without boundaries becomes self-erasure, and kindness without self-respect becomes submission. The man doesn't lose power because she took it. He loses power because he gave it away in the name of being understanding. The truth is, innocence doesn't mean lack of awareness. Many women are far more emotionally perceptive than men give them credit for. They know how certain expressions affect you. They know how silence makes you uncomfortable. They know how appearing unsure makes you step forward. And whether consciously or instinctively, they learn what works. They learn that softness opens doors that force never could. They learn that appearing harmless makes men lower defenses faster than confrontation ever would. And once that pattern is set, it becomes the default way influence operates. Understanding this isn't about becoming cold or suspicious. It's about reclaiming balance. It's about realizing that empathy should never come at the cost of self-respect, that innocence doesn't erase accountability, and that influence, even when subtle, still shapes outcomes. A grounded man can be compassionate without surrendering his frame. He can listen without absorbing guilt. He can care without carrying responsibility for emotions that aren't his to manage. And the moment he learns to do that, innocence stops being a weapon and becomes just another human trait, no longer capable of controlling him. Once this dynamic sets in, the man begins changing without noticing it. He starts filtering his words. He pauses before expressing frustration. He holds back truths that would normally come naturally to him, not because he's afraid of conflict, but because he doesn't want to hurt someone who appears emotionally delicate. Over time, that restraint becomes habitual. He stops speaking freely. He stops trusting his instincts, and the worst part is that he mistakes this self-censorship for emotional maturity. He thinks he's evolving. In reality, he's shrinking, and she feels that shift long before he does. What a woman often responds to is not innocence itself, but the power it gives her over the emotional direction of the relationship. When she appears unsure or overwhelmed, the man instinctively fills the gap. He becomes the stabilizer, the explainer, the emotional translator. He carries the weight so she doesn't have to. And because this happens gradually, it never feels like a takeover. It feels like cooperation. But cooperation without reciprocity quietly turns into control. He's managing the emotional climate while she moves freely within it. This is where attraction begins to fade on her side, even if she doesn't understand why. She no longer feels tension. She no longer feels polarity. She feels safe, but not in a way that excites her. She feels accommodated, managed, understood, and paradoxically, the more the man adapts himself around her emotional state, the less she respects him, not consciously, not maliciously, but instinctively. Because deep down, she knows he's adjusting himself instead of standing firm. And women don't feel desire for men who reorganize their inner world around them. The man, meanwhile, feels exhausted. He can't pinpoint why, but something feels off. He's doing everything right. He's being patient, supportive, emotionally available. Yet the connection feels heavier instead of deeper. Conversations drain him. He feels like he's walking on emotional glass. And because she still appears innocent, still confused, still sensitive, he blames himself for the tension. He assumes he's not communicating well enough, not being understanding enough. That self-blame tightens the loop and pulls him even further away from his natural center. Innocence becomes most powerful when it prevents consequences, when her actions are always reframed as misunderstandings, when her withdrawal is treated as confusion rather than choice, when her inconsistency is excused as emotional complexity. Accountability disappears, and where there is no accountability, there is no balance. The man keeps adjusting, she keeps floating, he keeps grounding, she keeps drifting, and because she never had to demand this arrangement, she doesn't feel responsible for it. It just becomes the emotional gravity of the relationship. What breaks this spell is not confrontation, it's clarity. The man eventually reaches a point where he notices a pattern, not one incident, not one argument, but a repeating emotional posture. He sees how often he's the one explaining, softening, accommodating. He sees how rarely she meets him with the same firmness. And that awareness is uncomfortable because it challenges the story he told himself about being the strong one. He realizes strength without boundaries is just endurance, and endurance without respect leads nowhere. The moment a man stops absorbing the emotional weight innocence places on him, the dynamic shifts. When he responds calmly instead of compensating, when he pauses instead of rescuing, when he lets silence exist instead of filling it, she feels it immediately, not as rejection, but as resistance. For the first time, she senses that her emotional posture no longer dictates his behavior. And that moment is critical, because now influence must become communication. Accountability must replace implication. And not every woman is comfortable in that space. Some women respond by stepping up. They become clearer, more direct, more grounded. They meet him where he stands instead of leaning on his emotional structure. But others react differently. They become confused, defensive, or distant, not because he changed, but because the leverage disappeared. Innocence no longer grants control, And without that control, the relationship must operate on mutual responsibility. That transition reveals everything, not about her goodness or badness, but about her capacity for emotional equality. Rontroins, this is why understanding innocence as influence is not about blaming women, it's about recognizing patterns. A man who understands this doesn't harden himself. He doesn't become cruel or dismissive, he becomes precise. He listens without absorbing, he cares without overfunctioning. He stays open without surrendering authority over his own emotional state. And that balance is what restores polarity, not dominance, not submission, but grounded presence. When innocence no longer controls you, something profound happens. You become selective. You no longer respond to softness by dissolving your boundaries. You no longer confuse vulnerability with helplessness. You no longer confuse empathy with obligation. You remain calm, attentive, and firm at the same time. And in that space, influence loses its grip, because a man who understands how innocence works psychologically is no longer pulled by it. He sees clearly, he moves deliberately, and he finally stops losing himself in relationships that quietly trained him to disappear. Once a man becomes aware of this pattern, he starts noticing how often his emotional responses were being shaped without his consent. He remembers moments where he wanted to speak firmly, but softened his tone instead. Moments where he felt disrespected, but brushed it off because he didn't want to seem harsh. Moments where his intuition told him something was off, yet he dismissed it because she appeared sincere, gentle, unsure. Looking back, he realizes he wasn't being kind, he was being managed. And the management didn't come through force. It came through emotional framing that made him feel responsible for her comfort at the expense of his own clarity. This is where many men feel anger for the first time, not toward her, but toward themselves. Anger for ignoring patterns, anger for overriding instincts, anger for believing that understanding someone meant tolerating imbalance. But that anger is necessary. It's the emotion that signals a boundary was crossed repeatedly without being defended. And once a man allows himself to feel that anger without suppressing it, he starts reclaiming ground he didn't realize he'd given up. He stops apologizing for reactions that were reasonable. He stops explaining discomfort that should have been obvious. He stops negotiating respect. A woman who relied on innocence to influence will sense this change immediately. Not because the man announces it, but because the emotional terrain shifts beneath her. He no longer rushes to fill silence. He no longer reassures without being asked. He no longer interprets her confusion for her. And that shift creates friction. She may feel unsettled, not because he's doing something wrong, but because the dynamic no longer favors emotional asymmetry. For the first time, she has to be intentional instead of implicit. And that requires maturity, something not everyone is prepared for. Some men make the mistake of swinging too far in the other direction. They harden, they withdraw emotionally, they become cold in an attempt to protect themselves. But the real growth doesn't come from closing off. It comes from staying open without collapsing. A grounded man can still listen deeply without absorbing emotional responsibility that isn't his. He can acknowledge confusion without rescuing it. He can care without carrying. That balance is what separates emotional intelligence from emotional submission. When innocence no longer works as leverage, communication becomes clearer or it falls apart. There's no longer room for implied expectations or unspoken pressure. Everything must surface, needs must be stated, boundaries must be respected, and in that clarity, the relationship either stabilizes or reveals its cracks. The man no longer has to guess. He no longer has to read between lines. He no longer has to anticipate emotional shifts. He simply responds to what is actually said and done. That alone restores peace. What many men don't expect is how relieving this feels. For the first time, they are no longer emotionally hypervigilant. They are no longer scanning for subtle cues, mood changes, or hidden meanings. They stop trying to be perfect. They stop trying to be endlessly patient. They stop feeling like one wrong word will destabilize everything. That relief is what real stability feels like. And once you experience it, you realize how draining the previous dynamic truly was. If the woman is capable of growth, she adjusts. She meets the man where he stands. She becomes clearer, more accountable, more direct. The relationship gains structure instead of emotional fog. But if she isn't, something else happens. She begins losing interest. Not because the man did anything wrong, but because influence no longer flows effortlessly. And this is where many men panic, mistaking her withdrawal as failure, when in reality, it's confirmation. Confirmation that the connection relied more on imbalance than mutual strength. This is the moment where a man either regresses or evolves. Regression looks like chasing clarity, re-explaining himself, reabsorbing emotional weight to keep her close. Evolution looks like letting her walk, if she chooses to. Not with anger, not with resentment, but with acceptance. He understands now that a woman who only felt safe when he carried her emotional world was never aligned with him to begin with, and no amount of empathy could change that. Chronotsum's The Tower of Understanding Innocence as influence is that it frees a man from self-betrayal. He no longer mistakes softness for helplessness. He no longer confuses confusion with innocence. He no longer assumes that emotional expression automatically deserves accommodation. He listens, he observes, he responds with calm authority, and because of that, he stops losing himself in relationships that quietly depended on him being smaller than he actually is. On the end, this awareness doesn't make a man cynical, it makes him selective. He no longer enters dynamics where he must constantly regulate another person's emotions to maintain peace. He no longer confuses empathy with obligation. He understands that real connection doesn't require shrinking. It requires two people standing on equal ground, and once a man understands that, innocence loses its power to influence him, not because he stopped caring, but because he finally started respecting himself. This pattern becomes especially clear in the early stages of dating, where ambiguity gives innocence even more power. A man notices how often she says she's unsure, overwhelmed, or confused about what she wants, and instead of pausing to observe, he steps in to stabilize the situation. He reassures her, he slows himself down, he gives more time, more patience, more emotional access. He tells himself he's being mature, but what's really happening is that he's anchoring a connection that hasn't earned stability yet. He's doing emotional labor before emotional commitment exists. In these moments, she doesn't need to ask for control, she just needs to remain undefined. Her uncertainty keeps him leaning forward, trying to bring clarity to something that isn't ready to be clear. And the more he leans, the more she relaxes. The more he explains, the less she has to. Over time, he becomes the emotional driver, while she becomes the emotional passenger. And the danger here isn't that she's malicious, it's that the roles solidify without discussion. He carries responsibility, she retains freedom. Trance texting makes this dynamic even stronger. Delayed replies framed as busyness, short responses framed as being tired, mixed signals framed as emotional complexity. Each time the man adjusts himself, he rereads messages, he rewrites responses, he waits longer than he wants to, he becomes strategic, not confident, and because she hasn't explicitly asked for anything, he never questions why he's the one doing all the adapting. Innocence thrives in ambiguity, because ambiguity shifts effort without accountability. Once the man begins to feel tension in his body before he ever understands it in his mind, a tightness when his phone lights up, a hesitation before he speaks honestly, a sense that he's constantly choosing words carefully. That tension is his intuition signaling imbalance, but instead of trusting it, he suppresses it. He tells himself he's overthinking. He tells himself relationships require patience. He tells himself this is normal, and in doing so, he overrides the very internal compass meant to protect him. What breaks this cycle isn't confrontation, it's stillness. The moment he stops compensating, things reveal themselves quickly. When he stops filling gaps, the gaps become visible. When he stops explaining, misunderstandings either resolve or deepen. When he stops accommodating, her effort either rises or fades, and that clarity, while uncomfortable, is honest. It shows whether the connection is mutual or simply supported by his emotional investment alone. A woman who is leaning on innocence will often respond to this shift with confusion. Not because she doesn't understand what's happening, but because the structure she relied on quietly disappeared. She may ask what's wrong. She may say you feel distant. She may sense the change without being able to name it. And this is the critical moment. If the man rushes to reassure again, the old dynamic snaps back into place. But if he stays calm, present, and grounded, something new forms or something ends. This is where many men learn a painful but freeing truth. Not every connection is meant to continue once balance is restored. Some connections only survive when one person carries more emotional weight than the other, and when that weight is set down, the connection collapses. That doesn't mean the man failed, it means the relationship was never built on equal footing to begin with, and realizing that hurts, but it also liberates. Men who reach this stage often describe a sense of quiet relief, not happiness, not excitement, relief. Relief from constant emotional vigilance, relief from trying to read between lines, relief from being the one who always understands first. That relief is the body recognizing safety. Again, safety in truth, safety in clarity, safety in not having to shrink to maintain harmony. From this place, a man's standards naturally rise, not in arrogance but in discernment. He no longer confuses emotional softness with compatibility. He no longer assumes vulnerability equals trustworthiness. He watches how a woman handles responsibility, clarity, and mutual effort. And if those things are missing, he doesn't try to fix it. He doesn't moralize it. He simply steps back, knowing that connection without balance will always demand self-erasure. Understanding how innocence can influence doesn't make a man colder, it makes him calmer. He still listens, he still cares, but he no longer absorbs emotional roles that were never meant to be his. He allows people to be who they are without rearranging himself to accommodate them. And in that space, relationships either deepen honestly or fall away quietly. Either outcome is peace. Because a man who understands this no longer loses himself trying to be gentle, he becomes grounded enough to be real. This dynamic doesn't disappear in long-term relationships, it deepens. What began as softness turns into expectation. What began as patience turns into obligation. The man becomes the emotional shock absorber for everything that goes wrong. If she's stressed, he adjusts. If she's distant, he compensates. If she's unsure, he reassures. And because Innocence framed these patterns early on, he rarely questions them. He tells himself, this is what commitment looks like. But slowly, his own emotional needs move further down the priority list, until one day he realizes they barely exist at all. Years later, men often describe the same feeling using different words: tired, numb, disconnected, unmotivated. They don't always blame the woman. Sometimes they don't blame anyone. They just feel empty. And that emptiness isn't caused by conflict. It's caused by constant self-suppression, by years of filtering reactions, softening instincts, carrying emotional weight that was never evenly shared. Innocence didn't create the exhaustion. The lack of balance did. Innocence just made the imbalance harder to see. Pronart is, what's painful is realizing how rarely he was asked what he felt. Not because she didn't care, but because the dynamic never required it. His stability was assumed, his resilience was taken for granted, his silence was mistaken for strength rather than depletion. And because he played the role so well, no one noticed the cost, including him. Men often don't break because of one big betrayal. They break because they were never allowed to be whole in the first place. When a man finally steps back emotionally, the reaction can be surprising. She may say he's changed, that he's colder, that he's less caring, but what she's really sensing is the absence of automatic accommodation. The emotional safety net she leaned on is no longer stretched beneath her, and that shift feels like loss, even if nothing outwardly dramatic happened. This is where clarity matters, because the man hasn't become worse, he's become honest with himself, or hogglers know. At this stage, the man often faces a choice he avoided for years: continue carrying a dynamic that drains him, or risk destabilizing the relationship by reclaiming balance. Neither option feels easy. One preserves comfort, the other preserves identity. And this is where many men finally understand that peace and comfort are not the same thing. Comfort keeps you functional, peace keeps you alive. Innocence can coexist with peace, but only when responsibility is shared, or if the woman is capable of growth. This moment becomes a turning point. She adjusts. She meets him with more clarity. She takes responsibility for her emotional state instead of outsourcing it. The relationship matures. It becomes quieter, more stable, more real. But if she isn't capable of that shift, something else happens. The connection begins to fade, not explosively, just slowly, and the man finally understands that the relationship was sustained by his self-sacrifice, not mutual strength. This realization doesn't make him bitter, it makes him precise. He stops overgiving, he stops rescuing, he stops absorbing emotions that aren't his to manage. He still listens, still supports, still cares, but he does so from a grounded place, and that groundedness becomes the new standard. Any relationship that requires him to abandon himself no longer qualifies, no matter how gentle it looks on the surface. Runtul, the man who understands this, doesn't walk around suspicious or hardened, he walks around aware. He notices when softness is paired with accountability and when it isn't. He notices when vulnerability invites connection and when it demands control. He notices when empathy flows both ways and when it only moves in one direction. And because he notices, He no longer loses years of his life trying to fix dynamics that were never meant to be fixed. The deepest shift happens internally. He stops questioning his instincts. He stops gaslighting himself into silence. He stops mistaking endurance for strength. And that internal alignment brings something he hasn't felt in a long time. Calm. Not the calm of resignation, but the calm of self-trust. He no longer needs to explain why something feels wrong. He listens to the signal and responds with clarity instead of guilt. Understanding how innocence can influence doesn't make a man less compassionate, it makes his compassion clean. It's no longer mixed with self-betrayal. It's no longer fueled by fear of being seen as harsh. It's grounded, selective, and honest. And from that place, relationships stop feeling like emotional labor and start feeling like partnership. Because a man who sees clearly no longer disappears quietly for love. He stands fully present and only stays where he's allowed to remain whole.